In the earlier videos within this series, we identified the scope of the standards, we identified contracts that would be accounted for within the revenue standards, we identified performance obligations, we determined the transaction price, and we allocated the transaction price. Now the final step in the process is to recognize revenue. The underlying principle is that revenue will either be recognized at a point in time or over time. There are three criteria that, if met, it will be recognized. Any one of those three criteria, if met, would indicate that the revenue will be recognized over time. If none of those criteria are met, the revenue will be recognized at a point in time. However, prior to going to those criteria and analyzing and discussing those, there's some instances that if these situations are present, then they could also impact when revenue will be recognized. So before we move to the three criteria for over time, we're going to look at the specific circumstances that can also impact revenue. As with all these videos, what you see on your screen is a software that we developed to help companies understand and implement the requirements of the revenue standards. This software is at tazglobal.co, and I'll be using it to help communicate the requirements of the standards. So you see the first question you're being asked is, does the agreement include bill and hold provisions? If it has bill and hold provisions within the agreement, not always, but in certain circumstances, it can impact when the revenue would be recognized. So for purposes of the example, let's say yes. So you're now asked four questions. So are the provisions of the bill and hold agreement substantive? If they are, then they do not in and of themselves impact revenue recognition, but you have to look at the other questions that are being asked. Are the products separately identified as belonging to the customer? The products have to be separately identified, so if they're not, then that will impact revenue recognition. Are the products ready for physical transfer to the customer? They have to be ready to be transferred to the customer, otherwise you cannot recognize revenue. And then, is the entity prevented from transferring the products to a third party? If yes, then if the other criteria are met, then you could recognize revenue. But if not, if the product could be transferred to any party, then you would not be able to recognize revenue. What would happen if you were to answer, are the provisions of the bill and hold agreement substantive, for example? If you say no, they're not substantive, you are going to be flagged by the software to identify which performance obligation the non-substantive provisions relate to, and for that performance obligation, you would not be able to recognize revenue. For purposes of the example, I'm going to go ahead and say yes to these questions here, and then we can move forward. So our next area, there's actually four of these, but the next area we're going to look at is, does the agreement include customer acceptance clauses where compliance cannot be objectively determined that the goods are compliant with agreed upon specifications? So if you have a customer acceptance clause and the acceptance terms are, has to meet a certain measurement, it must be 4 inches by 7 inches or something of this sort, you can objectively determine whether acceptance will be received. However, if you cannot objectively determine whether acceptance will be received, then it could impact revenue recognition. So once again, if you said yes, there's a customer acceptance clause, and you cannot objectively determine whether or not acceptance will be received, then you would be prompted to identify which performance obligation this scenario applies to. I'm going to say no, just so we can proceed with the analysis. The next question is, does the agreement include consignment provisions, or are there indicators that the agreement is a consignment of the related products? So if you were to answer yes, once again, you'd be prompted to identify which performance obligation. If a good or service is on consignment, then a sale actually has not occurred, so you would not recognize revenue. We're going to pause at this moment because this next section talks about repurchase provisions, and there's some complications associated with this, so we'll pick that up in the next video.